Well, Oklahomans busy cleaning up and rebuilding right now, and the costs are mounting. The most recent estimate has damage topping $2 billion. Well, now the debate over how to pay for it. And Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn says any additional disaster funds raised for his state should be offset with spending cuts. Now, some critics are calling that heartless, but Rich, you say he is absolutely right. Why?
See, this is the benefit of having people who are not running for re-election like Senator Coburn, because they can speak the truth. Look, in any household or small business, if you hadn't saved up for a rainy day and the rainy day happens, you have to take it out of cash flow, which means you have to take it out of other things. I wish the U.S. government would run that way. We wouldn't be in the pickle we are now with the size of the deficits and debt. Sabrina, is Rich right?
Well, you know, I'm sympathetic, but the fact is, I mean, Americans do want to cut spending. I'm one of them, but I think withholding funds in the time, for these victims who have faced an unbelievable tragedy to their town is not the way to accomplish this, nor is it good politics for Coburn's party. So I do think that in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy, which we did see all sorts of pork get folded into that bill, we have to be careful. But I'm not sure that Coburn's approach is the right one.
But, you know, Emac, you did some extraordinary reporting in Hurricane Sandy, pointing out how a lot of that funding that was supposed to go to the victims went to fix up buildings in Washington, D.C., which was not hit by Sandy. I mean, there was so much misuse in federal funds for Sandy, for Katrina, and on and on and on. It might happen here as well.
Yeah, you always wonder. It feels like, you know, every time there's a disaster, that the disaster hit D.C. and not the other parts of the country that really suffered because of the way D.C. behaves, turning these into, you know, big pork wagons. Through the 90s, the government did cut first, and then they basically offset disaster spending by cutting elsewhere in the budget under the Clinton administration. You saw that time and again. Both sides of the political aisle agreed to that. I don't see why we can't do that now. Yes, we got to get that money quickly to the people in Oklahoma, and our hearts go out to the victims and the families there. But, you know, I want to get them the money. This is an issue about Congress, and I think Rich Carlgard is right. They got to do it right and do it correctly and be fair.
And, Steve, Senator Coburn is consistent, by the way. Even after that awful bombing in Oklahoma City, he made sure that the funds for that were offset by cuts in the budget. He also was against Sandy funding because he knew it would be pork belt. There'd be a lot of pork projects in there, and he was right. So he is consistent.
He is consistent, and unfortunately, though, this is not the way to get real budget reform. It's going to have to be part of a comprehensive reform because it just allows people to portray him as heartless. Thankfully, as he pointed out, the costs are about $200 to $300 million because people had insurance in Oklahoma, so they can get out of the FEMA budget. They don't have to do extra funding and let it become a pork wagon, as Lizzie said. But in the future, we do need real reform, but this is not the vehicle, sadly, to do it.
Morgan, what do you think?
I 100% agree with Steve, and I'm still a little curious why we're having this discussion this week, days after this disaster took place, when $12 billion is in the FEMA fund right now. So I think the most important thing is to get that money out to the victims. I think when you start adding red tape to the process, I think the taxpayers that get hurt the most by that are the victims on the ground. I think historically we saw this with Hurricane Katrina. A lot of the direct aid that was going to homeowners was tied up for years. The lower Ninth Ward is still smarting from that, and we saw this pork. Yes, pork was an issue, but there are still a lot of small businesses that were hurt. I live in Lower Manhattan. Small businesses that were hurt in the last storm, in Superstorm Sandy, and they closed their doors. They won't be reopening those.
But John,
get that money to those people.
It's one thing to be against red tape. That's a good thing. But can't you at the same time be against the pork spending that's often loaded into these disaster programs?
Well, obviously, it's a tough question to answer right now when we see what's happened there. It's obviously disastrous. But, I mean, I think it's very dangerous when we federalize every disaster, when people in New Mexico have to pay for something unthinkable that happened in Oklahoma. And at some point, we've got to stop doing this. If the federal government stays out of this, people will be more careful about the insurance they buy, and they'll also be more careful about the politicians they elect so that they have someone good in place when the unthinkable strikes.
Well, Steve, what about that? That's the libertarian view, really getting rid of the federal role here entirely.
That's a nice principle, but in the real world, when you see a disaster happen, people are going to want to say, get the aid there. And thankfully, most people were insured, which is a good thing, which is why the bill for the government would be $200 to $300 million, which they can get out of the existing budget. But the whole thing on budget reform, trying to do it in the wake of a disaster like this, is not going to get the job done. It just feeds ammunition, so to speak, to the opposition. Make it part of a real reform. If you want to get aid there, get it out another part of the budget. But this is not the vehicle to do it.
Rich, you're holding up most of the argument by yourself. Go ahead.
Well, look, I agree it's bad politics, but thank God there are people, plain-spoken people like Senator Coburn or the retired Senator Alan Simpson who will speak the inconvenient truth about the budget mess that we're in. So simply to get this idea into circulation that money isn't free is a good idea. But I say get the aid to the people as soon as possible.
But we do like plain speaking in politics. There is far too little of that. Coming up, forget buyer beware, retailer beware. Why all those stores advertising big holiday sales this weekend could be opening themselves up to lawsuits from customers. Well, retailers rolling out Memorial Day sales, but they better be careful. A judge in California just ruling shoppers can sue Kohl's after a customer there claimed its markdowns are bogus. Now, before shoppers jump for joy over this, Sabrina says stores should be able to advertise any price they want. Explain your flip side, Sabrina.
Well, look, this is absurd. I mean, first of all, we all know that marketing is about perception, and Kohl's wants to be perceived as a low-cost alternative to other department stores. But the reality is this is about personal responsibility. I looked at my email inbox before I came over here, and it was filled with announcements for Memorial Day sales. Are we going to limit how many emails I'm allowed to receive? What if I actually acted on all of that? My bank account would be empty. So I think that we have to remember that there's an important layer of personal responsibility in all of this.
All right. By the way, we should mention that Kohl's disputes the allegations in the case, rejecting claims of false advertising. But, Rick, doesn't it always come down to buyer beware? You've got to beware if you're shopping out there.
That's exactly the point. That is what you want it to come down to, or what Sabrina wants it to come down to, is buyer beware. Sabrina, would you expect that those emails that you got with sales would be fraudulent lies? If you're going to send out an email saying we have things on sale, shouldn't it be on sale? What happened in California was the people. It was an initiative. The people passed a law that required that there be truth in that kind of advertising. How can you criticize?
But hold on. Before Sabrina answers, I got to say, Mike Ozanian, that there is always some kind of exaggeration in these sales, is there not?
Well, listen, David, the Ninth Circuit Court is one of the most liberal in the country. Its rulings typically get overturned by the Supreme Court when they make it that far. The lower court ruled that there was no financial harm to shoppers. I think this is a bogus claim. This is basically the liberal court trying to pay back the tort lawyers who help finance their campaigns.
And, Morgan, all we need is something to bring more lawyers into our lives, right?
Wait a second here. FTC actually defines what constitutes a sale and what doesn't. There's actually legislation on the books. There are court cases that have set precedents around this. I actually take false advertising, whether it's real or whether a court strikes it down. I take this very seriously because, you know what, at the end of the day, it can undermine consumer confidence. It can undermine an entire industry. We saw this to, a huge extent with the mortgage industry in the past decade or so. I take false advertising very seriously. People should be allowed to bring whatever lawsuit they want forward. Whether they win, that's a totally different story.
But, Steve, the fact is you can sue anybody for anything. Let's be honest about this. The way that you can interpret every little detail and things can bring the lawyers into the situation. We've got enough lawyers in. We don't need more, do we?
We don't. And in this day of handhelds, David, and PCs, you can quickly check, is this a good price or not?
That's true. So, again, it comes back, Rick, to the idea of buyer beware. We have enough tools at our disposal right now to beware.
As somebody who has spent a lot of time in the California courts as a lawyer, not as a defendant, I can tell you that these kinds of cases are not jamming up the California courts. You'll see one in a million, so come on.
Just one in a million. Just wait. That's all we need. That's at least 300, by the way. Next, no false advertising here. Our informers have stocks on sale right now, and that's the truth.